On tonight's story, on Division 8, we're diving into the abandoned Blackwood Logging Company, where decades ago, workers vanished without a trace. Hidden ledgers, forbidden areas, and rumors of toxic spills have kept locals silent for generations. Tonight, we follow Ethan, a young investigator, as he steps inside the decaying camp, where greed, mistakes, and secrets refuse to stay buried. It started with a call. The kind of call you don't expect, from a number you barely recognize, and a voice that pulls something deep out of you. Familiar, grave, urgent. Ethan, it's about your grandfather. You need to come, now. The line went dead before he could ask more, leaving only the echo of that word, now. Then the rain started. Real, relentless, the kind that drives rivers over roads and turns gravel into treacherous mud. Ethan gripped the steering wheel of his aging Ford pickup, the tires slipping as he climbed the steep, twisting road through the Allegheny foothills. The GPS had gone silent miles ago, swallowed by fog so thick it felt like a wall pressing against the windshield. Headlights barely pierced the gray, and the forest seemed to lean in closer with every turn. He didn't know what to expect at the property. His grandfather had always been a private man, stubborn and secretive, the sort who spoke in clipped sentences and left things half-finished, hidden in drawers or sheds. Now he was gone, and Ethan was on his way to a place he hadn't visited in years, half childhood memory, half rumor, entirely isolated. The house appeared almost without warning. Roofs sagged under decades of rain and snow, shingles missing, windows dark and dull. A single rickety porch sagged under its own weight, weeds clawing through broken boards. It wasn't just abandoned, it looked like it had been forgotten entirely, left to rot at the edge of the forest. Ethan killed the engine and stepped out, boots sinking into the mud immediately. The drizzle soaked him through in seconds, soaking the back of his shirt and turning his hair into a wet halo against his hood. He noticed the silence first. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath. No birds, no insects, no sound but the dripping of water and the squelch of mud beneath his feet. The front door had a rusted padlock. He twisted it with the crowbar in his hand until it snapped, letting the door swing open with a long, whining creak that echoed into the empty halls. Inside, the smell hit him. Wet wood, mold, decay, and something faintly metallic he couldn't place. Dust lay thick over every surface, broken furniture, old newspapers, even a coat hanging on a peg by the door. The house hadn't been touched in decades. And then he noticed it, a faint smear along the wall near the staircase, dark and irregular, glistening in the dim light. Fresh. Ethan swallowed. "It's probably nothing," he muttered, but even as he said it, the house seemed to shift around him. The shadows felt heavier, the silence deeper, and the air carried a warning he couldn't shake. He was here now, and whatever secrets this place held, they were waiting. Ethan moved deeper into the house, boots squelching on the soaked floorboards. Each step felt louder than the last, echoing through the empty rooms like someone, or something, was listening. The living room was a museum of decay, a broken rocking chair, a sofa caved in at the center, and stacks of yellowed newspapers piled in corners, some curling from damp, some brittle with age. Dust motes floated in the gray light filtering through grimy windows. He ran a hand along a windowsill. The wood was slick with moisture, warped from years of neglect. Outside, the yard was a tangle of weeds and fallen branches. A rusted swing swayed slowly in the breeze, though the wind was barely a whisper. Something about the motion set his teeth on edge. He shook his head. "It's just the house settling," he muttered, though the words sounded hollow. He wandered toward the back, drawn by a memory he couldn't quite place. His grandfather had loved that side of the property, the one where the old barn leaned dangerously, half swallowed by ivy. The barn's doors hung open like gaping mouths. Inside, the smell of rot hit him stronger, mingling with the tang of rust and something faintly sweet, metallic, almost like blood. He froze, listening. Only the soft drip of water from a broken roof. Only the creak of the floor under his weight. Near the barn, a pile of old tools and machinery lay half buried in leaves and mud. He noticed something poking out from the top, a rolled-up map tied with a frayed string. Hands trembling, he pulled it free. The paper was yellowed, edges brittle, and the ink faded, but he could make out lines forming grids, marks that seemed deliberate. Certain areas were crossed out, others circled, almost like warnings. A sudden sound behind him, a low, wet thump, made him spin. Nothing. Just shadows, twisting in the rain-soaked twilight. His heartbeat picked up. He stepped back toward the house, eyes darting to every corner. The silence felt wrong now, unnatural, heavy. He tucked the map into his jacket and forced himself to take another breath. Just an old barn, old maps, nothing more. But as he climbed the steps back inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that the land itself was watching, and that whatever it had seen decades ago, it hadn't forgotten. The phone rang just as Ethan reached the porch, cutting through the steady patter of rain. His heart jumped. He had no cell service for miles. How was anyone calling? Shoving the map into his backpack, he fumbled for the old landline near the wall. The receiver was heavy in his hand, cord tangled like a snake. "Hello?" he said, voice uneven. "Ethan?" A gravelly voice answered, low, wary. "It's Walter, your grandfather's old neighbor. Don't come out tonight." Ethan blinked. Walter? He hadn't met him, not since he was a kid. "Sorry, who?" "Walter. I've lived down the road for too long. Just trust me. That property, it's not what you think. Your grandfather, he made mistakes. Big ones. And some things on that land, some things you don't want to wake." The line crackled, the rain and static mixing. Ethan frowned. "I don't understand. Mistakes? Wake what?" "Things that don't belong to us. Things that linger. That map you've got? Leave it. Leave it where you found it." "Look, Ethan's protest cut off as a loud thud came from inside the barn. He froze, the hairs on his neck standing up. "Wait, did you hear that?" "Don't go poking around. You're too late to be careful. I've been watching that place for decades and—" The voice lowered to a whisper, almost drowned by the rain. "If you go inside after dark, you might not come back the same." Static filled the line. Then nothing. Ethan held the receiver, heart pounding, staring into the gray curtain of rain. The words refused to leave his mind. Not what I think. Mistakes. Linger. The house groaned under the wind. The barn seemed darker than before, and the air felt thicker, almost alive. He clenched the map, shaking slightly. The thought of turning back flickered in his mind, but it was already too late. Curiosity, that dangerous spark his grandfather had warned him about, pushed him forward. From somewhere deep in the woods, a low, wet scrape echoed, barely audible over the rain. Ethan's stomach tightened. He glanced at the forest line, where shadows pooled like spilled ink. Whatever Walter was warning him about, it was out there, waiting. Ethan didn't sleep that night. The rain hammered the roof in endless drumming. The wind moaned through broken windows, and every shadow in the house seemed to stretch toward him. By dawn, he had decided he couldn't ignore Walter's warning, but curiosity had its own stubborn grip. The old neighbor had agreed to meet him at the edge of the property. Ethan drove slowly through the mud, the tires struggling over deep ruts. Walter's truck appeared like a ghost through the gray mist, parked near the boundary where the forest met the clearing. The man was older than Ethan remembered from childhood photos. Thin, hunched, coat pulled tight, eyes sharp and alert. "Morning," Walter said without preamble, voice rough as gravel. He held a thermos, shaking slightly. "You should have listened last night. You should have stayed in that truck." "I got your warning," Ethan said, trying to mask the unease creeping into his chest. "But I need to know. What's out here? What did my grandfather do?" Walter exhaled slowly, eyes scanning the property as if the wind itself might carry secrets to him. "Your grandfather ran this place when it was still a logging camp. But he wasn't just logging trees. There were experiments, accidents, mistakes. Men went missing, machinery malfunctioned, chemicals spilled. No one's ever talked about it, but your grandfather kept records." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Maps, ledgers, notebooks. He documented it all. And some of those things, machines, land, never should have been left alone. Some things, you can't just leave." Ethan frowned. "Leave? Are we talking danger? Legal trouble?" Walter shook his head. "No, worse. That land holds consequences. Long after your grandfather died, it didn't let them go. Workers disappeared, fires started, landslides, toxic ponds formed. People whispered, cursed. Not the supernatural kind. Real, tangible consequences. And he left you in charge, whether you knew it or not." The words sank like stones. Ethan's fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter, the mud beneath the truck suddenly feeling like quicksand. "So, the ledger? The map? Those things mark the worst of it. Hazards your grandfather tried to control, but he underestimated them. Follow them, and you'll find out why I keep my distance." Walter's gaze flicked to the dark forest line, where shadows pooled like water in a basin. "If you ignore me, you might not make it through the week. That property? It watches. It waits. It doesn't forgive curiosity." Ethan stared, swallowed hard, and nodded. Somewhere in the back of his mind, excitement flickered, an investigator's thrill, but it was tangled with dread. Walter's warning wasn't just words. Something real, something dangerous waited in those ruins, and it knew he was coming. Ethan didn't wait long after Walter left. The rain had eased to a fine drizzle, but the mud was still thick and slick, clinging to his boots as he climbed toward the main cluster of buildings. The first thing that hit him was the smell, a pungent mix of wet wood, rust, and something metallic, coppery, like blood but faint, lingering just under the nose. The largest building was a warehouse, its wooden siding rotted and warped, nails protruding at odd angles. The double doors sagged on their hinges, one hanging so low it scraped the ground with a rasping sound every time the wind shifted. Ethan shoved it open. Inside, beams of gray light cut through gaps in the walls, illuminating piles of equipment that hadn't moved in decades. Chains hung from hooks, rusted and swinging slightly with the faintest draft. Old conveyor belts curled in unnatural angles, their rubber cracked and brittle. He stepped carefully, trying not to disturb the brittle debris. His flashlight beam picked up old crates stamped with names of logging companies, chemical suppliers, and government agencies. Some crates were broken open, their contents spilling onto the dusty floor. Nails, tools, bottles with faded labels warning of toxic contents. His stomach churned. Then he saw the ledger. It was tucked under a collapsed shelf, its leather cover warped and water-stained, but intact. Ethan flipped it open. Handwriting, cramped and precise, filled the pages. Names of workers, dates, notes about shipments and machinery, but also strange entries about missing men, accidents that weren't recorded officially, warnings in the margins. "Do not touch the northern machinery after dark. It watches." He froze. The northern section of the warehouse had a massive machine, half buried in shadow. A belt, still faintly oily, ran along the floor, twisting into darkness. The machine looked dormant, but something about it felt alive, like it remembered the hands that had operated it, the mistakes, the injuries, the disappearances. A sudden clatter made him spin. Nothing, just the wind, or something else moving, careful, deliberate, just beyond the flashlight's beam. Ethan's pulse quickened. The ledger trembled in his hands. The words on the page didn't just recount history, they warned him. And somewhere deep in the building, beneath the hum of rain on the roof, something stirred, waiting for the inevitable curiosity of the living to cross into its domain. Ethan couldn't tear his eyes away from the ledger. Every page seemed to pull him deeper, the cramped handwriting twisting into warnings and fragmented stories of the men who had vanished over the years. Names repeated with unsettling frequency: Thompson, Galloway, Redford. Dates that ended abruptly or were crossed out as if someone had tried to erase them. He crouched on the cold, splintered floor, tracing a finger along a note scrawled in a shaky hand. "The northern machine knows. Do not awaken it. We buried what we couldn't fix." His stomach clenched. Something in the warehouse wasn't just abandoned, it was waiting, patient and aware. A distant metallic groan echoed through the cavernous space. Ethan froze. It came again, a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate through the floor. He shined his flashlight toward the northern machine. Its pulleys and belts were still, yet the air around it shimmered, as if the machine itself was holding its breath. He took a cautious step forward. Mud from outside had tracked into the building, leaving streaks along the cracked floorboards. The shadows shifted unnaturally with each beam of light, and for a heartbeat, Ethan thought he saw something, a silhouette, pressing against the far wall. Impossible, he told himself, forcing a laugh. There's no one here. But the ledger continued to grip his attention. One entry in particular froze him. The accident was not an accident. The men tried to leave. It followed. Keep the ledger safe. Don't go near the machine after dark. Ethan's mind raced. The stories weren't just warnings. They were confessions. Human greed, mismanagement, carelessness had built this place into a trap, a tomb. And yet, the ledger implied something else, something alive in the ruins, something that remembered. He glanced at the ceiling, where water dripped through holes in the rotting beams, splashing onto rusted metal. Somewhere above, a floorboard creaked, and then another. Ethan's breath hitched. He wasn't alone. Not entirely. Something moved just out of sight, silent, watching, waiting. And the ledger, clutched in his hands, felt suddenly heavier, as if it carried the weight of every life lost in this place. Every secret buried under mud, machinery, and time. Ethan swallowed hard. This was no longer just a property to explore. This was a place with a memory that didn't want to be disturbed. Night fell faster than Ethan expected, the last vestiges of sunlight swallowed by thick, rolling clouds. Rain had stopped, but the mud glistened black under the feeble light of his flashlight as he stepped outside, feeling the weight of the ledger in his backpack. The forest pressed close, skeletal trees swaying silently, their branches scratching against one another like dry bones. From the edge of the property came a soft sound, a tapping, steady, irregular. Ethan froze. He listened. Tap, pause, tap, tap. Not the rhythm of falling branches or rain, not anything natural. Something small but deliberate, moving closer. He forced himself to move toward the workshop where the northern machine stood. Every step squelched in the mud, and each splash seemed amplified, a loud betrayal in the silence. He reached the doorway and shined his light inside. The machine, inert in daylight, now seemed different, ominous. Shadows pooled in its gears, bending and stretching unnaturally. The temperature dropped, and Ethan's breath fogged in the weak beam. A metallic groan echoed from somewhere deeper in the warehouse, low and unrelenting. He whipped around, scanning the corners. Nothing. Just racks of tools, crates, and dust motes dancing in the flashlight's cone. Then came a soft scuff, like boots moving across the floor above him. Another floorboard creaked. Ethan's stomach tightened. He remembered the ledger's warning. Don't go near the machine after dark. But he had to understand. He had to know why men had vanished decades ago, why the forest seemed to swallow their screams. The tapping grew louder. Now it was accompanied by something else, a wet, sliding sound against the wooden floor, like mud being smeared. His eyes darted around, heart pounding. A shadow detached itself from the far wall, a smear of darkness, impossible to pin down, and vanished as quickly as it appeared. Ethan's rational mind screamed there must be an explanation. Rodents, branches, tricks of the light. But the instinct in his gut, the one that had kept him alive climbing the Allegheny roads, told him otherwise. He stepped back toward the exit. Another scuff, this time closer. The machine shivered, a low vibration running through the floor, sending dust into the air. And then, almost imperceptibly, a voice, human, whispered from somewhere behind the walls. You shouldn't be here. Ethan's grip on his flashlight tightened. He wanted to run, to flee into the mud and forest, but curiosity chained him to the spot. He had crossed into a property that remembered everything, and now it was remembering him. Morning came like a reluctant sigh, the clouds still thick, letting only a gray light drip across the property. Ethan woke on the creaking cot in the workshop, muscles sore and mind restless. The storm had passed, but the air still held the sharp, wet scent of mud and decay. His backpack with the ledger lay beside him, its leather cover cold and damp to the touch. He stepped outside, boots sinking into the slick yard, and froze. Along the wall of the main house were streaks in the mud, thin, uneven lines, dark against the lighter dirt. They led from the forest edge toward the basement window. Not footprints exactly, more like something had slid itself along the ground, leaving a smear behind. Ethan crouched, tracing the streak with a gloved finger. The mud had dried slightly, cracked in places, but the pattern was deliberate. Something, or someone, had been here last night, closer than he dared imagine. His stomach tightened. The ledger's warnings echoed in his mind. They watch, they follow, they know. He moved around the house, flashlight in hand despite the daylight. Every window reflected his own cautious movements back at him, shadows bending strangely where none should exist. The forest pressed in from all sides, a wall of dark, whispering green. From the tree line came the occasional snap of a branch or rustle of leaves, but nothing seemed random anymore. Inside, he returned to the workshop, the machine looming in the corner like a dormant predator. Dust covered it, but in the morning light, he noticed new marks, scratches along the metal plates, gouges in the floor beneath. Nothing heavy enough for a person to leave, at least, not obviously. He shivered, realizing he couldn't be the only one, or the only thing, moving around last night. The ledger called to him, its pages begging to be read again. He opened it to a new entry, words smudged but legible. The paths are open. Do not cross them. Once you see, you cannot unsee. He felt the weight of the forest behind the words, a presence pressing in, patient and calculating. Ethan knew he had to explore the rest of the property to understand why men had vanished decades ago. But the streaks under the window, the whispering woods, the cold, unspoken warnings, it all suggested one thing. This place was alive in its own way, and it had already noticed him. Ethan spent the afternoon inside the main house, cautiously making his way from room to room. Dust motes swirled in the slanted light through broken blinds, and every step on the warped floorboards produced a groan that seemed to echo far longer than it should. In the study, he found a chest tucked under the window, half hidden beneath yellowed curtains. The lock was long gone, and inside were piles of papers, letters, and a small, leather-bound notebook. He picked up the notebook, its cover cracked and worn, pages frayed at the edges. The handwriting was uneven, almost frantic in places, clearly his grandfather's. Ethan flipped to the first entry, the date nearly 40 years ago. Henry had written of strange accidents at the logging camp, men disappearing into the woods, machines breaking in impossible ways. The words were careful at first, almost clinical, but as the entries progressed, the tone shifted. Fear crept into the margins, ink smudged as if by trembling hands. They know when you step wrong. The land remembers every misstep. I hear them whispering at night. Some pages were torn or scorched along the edges, as though someone, or something, had tried to erase them. Ethan read on, heart hammering. The notebook described events no one had believed. Lights moving through the trees, shadows that seemed to have a mind of their own, men trapped in the mud and never found. Each story ended with the same warning. Do not touch the ledger. Do not follow the paths. Do not... The last word trailed off, smeared beyond recognition. A sudden sound made him jump, a low, wet thump from the floor above. The house settled with a groan, or something heavier moved. Ethan swallowed hard and gripped the notebook tighter. Every entry, every warning, every half-erased note seemed to point to a truth he wasn't ready to face. The logging site hadn't just been abandoned. Something remained, watching, waiting, and learning. He realized then that the ledger wasn't just a record of numbers or accounts. It was a key, a warning. And the notebook made clear, to understand the ledger, to survive what lingered here, he would have to confront the same terrors his grandfather had tried, and failed, to escape. By late afternoon, the rain had eased to a steady drizzle, but the mud outside was a treacherous mess, sucking at Ethan's boots as he made his way to the back of the property. The outbuildings loomed closer now, their wood warped and slick, their corners black with rot. One shed in particular drew his attention, the one his grandfather's notebook referred to repeatedly, the place where the ledger had been kept and where the machines had been stored. The door was ajar, creaking in the wind, or something heavier. Ethan pushed it fully open and stepped inside. The air smelled of oil, rust, and something else, something coppery that made the back of his throat dry. There, in the center of the floor, lay the ledger. Its leather cover was coated in dust, the edges cracked. But the moment Ethan touched it, the room seemed to shift. A cold draft swept through, though no windows were open. The sound of metal scraping on metal echoed somewhere behind him, slow, deliberate. He turned sharply. Nothing. The shadows seemed deeper than they should have been, stretching and folding in the corners. He swallowed hard, flipping the ledger open. Numbers and logs filled the pages, but interspersed were odd notations, cryptic symbols, phrases like, "They rise when we disturb the earth," and drawings of twisted shapes that seemed impossibly alive. A low, wet thump came from the back of the shed, then another, then a slow, dragging sound that made his stomach knot. Ethan's pulse raced. The notebook had warned him about curiosity, but this, touching the ledger, felt different. He could almost hear a whisper, soft at first, just on the edge of hearing. "Leave. Now. Leave." He shook his head, trying to dismiss it as the wind, but the ledger vibrated faintly under his fingers, as if reacting to his presence. A sudden crash made him stumble backward. Something heavy shifted in the shadows, and he caught a glimpse of mud-streaked shapes at the edges of the shed, moving too quickly to be human. Heart hammering, Ethan realized the warnings weren't superstition. The ledger, the notebook, the abandoned logging camp, it had all been alive with secrets, and now, by uncovering them, he had awakened whatever had been waiting. Night fell hard, faster than Ethan expected, swallowing the logging camp in darkness thicker than the storm clouds had promised. The rain had stopped, leaving everything slick and gleaming, reflecting the faint moonlight like broken glass. He stayed inside the shed, the ledger clutched tightly in his hands, but the shadows outside were no longer passive. They twisted and pulsed, moving with a rhythm that didn't belong to the wind. A low rumble shook the ground beneath him. He stumbled backward, dropping the ledger. Mud and debris shifted around the shed's perimeter, forming dark, amorphous shapes that crept closer, dripping with wet earth. Whispers rose from the mud, soft at first, indistinguishable murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Leave. Return it. You shouldn't be here." The voice was wet, gurgling, almost alive. Ethan grabbed the ledger again, heart hammering. Every instinct screamed to run, but the paths outside were slick with mud, and the shapes were already stretching toward him. One larger form surged, a wave of darkness mixed with thick, wet soil. It struck the shed with a groaning crash, splintering a section of the wall. He scrambled to the corner, kicking over boxes to block the gap, mud and dark water splashing over his boots. The whispers grew louder, angrier, overlapping. Shapes moved in ways no human body could, sliding over the ground, climbing the walls, as if the earth itself had come alive to claim what was disturbed. Ethan's breath came in short gasps. The ledger vibrated in his hands, and he realized with sudden clarity, this was what the notebook had warned about. The logging camp wasn't just abandoned, it had been trapped, and by reopening its secrets, he had pulled the lid off whatever had been buried for decades. He stumbled toward the back door, only to see one of the mud forms pressing against the wooden frame, wet fingers of darkness seeping through cracks. His mind raced. There had to be a way to contain this, to return whatever had been moved, but the ledger offered only fragments, instructions, warnings, unfinished notes. A sudden screeching noise split the night, the sound of metal grinding against stone, and Ethan realized the machinery his grandfather had once used might not have been abandoned either. It had waited, and now it wanted him to play its part. The night pressed in around him, heavier than ever, as Ethan scrambled through the shed toward the back exit. Mud-slick shapes churned outside, clinging to the walls and splintered boards, whispering threats in voices that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Each step was a battle against the squelching mud, each breath a ragged gasp as the air thickened with the scent of wet soil and something fouler, almost metallic. He reached the door and yanked it open, rainwater from the earlier storm still dripping from the roof. Outside, the forms twisted and writhed, mud-cloaked shapes advancing like predators that had learned patience over decades. Ethan's first instinct was to run, but the ledger pulsed in his hands, almost humming, urging him back toward the center of the camp. Its cryptic entries mentioned returning what was disturbed and the land hungers for balance. He didn't understand fully, but he felt it. If he didn't act, he would become part of this place. The ground trembled beneath him as a larger, more solid mass surged from the mud, nearly toppling him. He realized the forms weren't just mud. They were amalgamations of earth, detritus, and some unholy energy left behind by decades of reckless logging. Desperate, he remembered a passage in the notebook about the old logging machine, half buried near the creek. It had been used to dig deep channels in the forest floor, a place where the land's anger had been anchored. Maybe, just maybe, he could use it to return what was stirred. He ran, slipping, sliding, mud coating his jeans and jacket, toward the old machine. The whispers intensified, screaming now, rattling the trees and echoing off the broken buildings. Each step was a struggle, but the ledger guided him, almost glowing faintly in the darkness. Reaching the machine, he found the controls rusted but movable. Sweat and mud slicked his hands as he fumbled with levers, following the cryptic instructions. Return the flow, guide the hunger back, do not resist. A massive wave of the mud creature surged forward, and Ethan braced himself. The machine groaned, creaked, and shuddered under his grip, earth and darkness beginning to respond. It was working, but barely. The night was far from over, and the shadows weren't done testing him. The sheen, covered in mud and soaked through, chest heaving. The rain had stopped, leaving the forest damp and steaming, the mist curling around broken boards and fallen beams like reluctant ghosts. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, tasting the crisp, wet air and feeling the ache in his muscles. Somehow, he had survived the night. The camp was quiet, but not peaceful. The mud that had wriggled and hissed yesterday was now a solid, inert mess, congealed around the paths and machine like some grotesque sculpture. Footprints, his and others, marred the dirt, but the shapes he had faced were nowhere to be seen. Yet, Ethan could feel it in the air. They hadn't gone far. They were waiting, patient as predators, coiled in the shadows beyond sight. He glanced at the ledger, mud streaking the edges of its pages. The cryptic notes now made more sense in some ways. The warnings about disturbing the flow and balancing the hunger weren't metaphorical. The land had been wronged, and someone had paid the price. Generations of logging, waste, and recklessness had left a mark that the forest, the mud, and the forgotten machinery now demanded to be corrected. Ethan realized he couldn't linger. The house, the sheds, even the creek where the machine had been anchored, everything held secrets that were still alive, still watching. He needed to prepare, to plan his next move carefully. There would be no sudden heroics, no running blindly. The ledger would guide him, but it was only a map of warnings, not solutions. And then he saw it. A thin streak of mud climbing up the side of the house, fresh, as if something, or someone, had watched him all night and decided he had survived long enough. His stomach knotted. The camp might be calm for now, but the land's reckoning was far from over. Ethan tightened his grip on the ledger. He had endured the night, but the real trial was only beginning. Night fell hard, swallowing the logging camp in thick shadows. The rain had eased to a steady drizzle, but the forest beyond the property whispered with its own rhythm, branches tapping against windows, water sliding down tin roofs, the occasional crack of a distant tree falling. Ethan sat in the living room, notebook open on his lap, flashlight casting trembling beams across the room. He could feel the house watching him, as if every corner and hallway was aware of his presence. The first sign was subtle, a soft thud from the back of the house, where the old mill building leaned against the edge of the forest. At first, he told himself it was just the wind. Then, another thud, heavier, closer. He rose slowly, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline, and peered through the rain-streaked windows. Mud. Tracks. They weren't footprints, not quite. The smeared shapes twisted across the yard toward the main house, sliding through the grass and pooling near the porch. He swallowed hard, stomach tight. Whatever had made them was moving with purpose. A sudden scraping at the door made him jump. His flashlight swung toward it, and he saw it. Shadows writhing at the edges of the porch. Dark forms that didn't match any trees or furniture. They were alive, and they were watching. Ethan's mind raced. Every story he'd read about haunted places, curses, and disasters now felt like real-life manuals. The ledger, the old maps, the warnings from Walter, they weren't just stories, they were instructions for survival. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the yard. For a brief moment, he saw the shapes more clearly. Mud-colored, almost humanoid, crawling across the ground in awkward, jerking motions. He backed away from the window, heart pounding. He had to act. Whatever force he was dealing with wasn't just bound to the boundaries of the property. It was growing bolder. And tonight, it had learned he was alone. With trembling hands, Ethan grabbed the notebook and the map, tracing the symbols that hinted at the ledger's hiding place. If he wanted to survive, he had to face whatever had been lurking in the shadows before it found him fully. Ethan spent the early hours of the morning poring over the notebook, his hands shaking from the cold and the adrenaline that refused to fade. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, almost frantic, detailing events from decades ago, workers disappearing, strange machinery operating at odd hours, and warnings scrawled in the margins. Do not move it. Do not touch it. It sees everything. The ledger mentioned in the old maps was not just a record of production or payroll. It cataloged experiments, toxic spills, and incidents that had been buried, both physically and legally. The more he read, the more he understood the magnitude of what had happened here. It wasn't a ghost story or a curse. It was human recklessness magnified by secrecy. Still, the fear he felt wasn't entirely rational. There were details in the notebook that hinted at consequences for anyone who disturbed the site, written in a tone so certain that it was almost impossible to ignore. He traced the ledger's location on the map again, the basement of the old mill building, underneath a collapsed support beam. Getting there meant crossing the yard, now slick with mud, and past the shadowed forms that had begun moving whenever he approached the windows. Ethan's stomach knotted. The mud tracks from last night were still there, leading straight to the mill. He grabbed a flashlight, tightened the strap on his jacket, and forced himself outside. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the world dripping and silent, save for the occasional drip of water from the rotting eaves. Each step toward the mill felt heavier, as if the earth itself was resisting him. At the edge of the yard, he paused, listening. Low, gurgling sounds, like mud shifting over metal, echoed from the mill. Shadows slithered across the ground, refusing to stay in place. He swallowed his fear and pressed forward. Whatever had been lurking, whatever had been waiting, he had no choice but to confront it. Tonight, he would find the ledger. Tonight, he would uncover the truth. And tonight, he would see whether human greed had truly left something alive, something that refused to be forgotten. Night had fallen completely, swallowing the logging camp in darkness so thick it felt like a physical weight pressing against Ethan's chest. He stood at the edge of the collapsed mill, the flashlight trembling in his hand, casting long, jittering shadows across the mud and broken timber. Every instinct screamed to turn back, but the ledger, and the truth, was somewhere inside. The low, gurgling sounds returned, closer now, coming from under the boards, from the shadows themselves. Mud shifted unnaturally, forming shapes that wriggled and stretched toward him, almost alive. The air smelled metallic and sour, a combination of rain-soaked earth and old chemical decay. He remembered the notebook's warnings. Do not disturb it. Do not bring it out. The earth itself will punish you. Heart-hammering, Ethan forced himself forward, stepping over the twisted remnants of machinery. He pried open a rotting hatch into the basement. Inside, darkness pooled, thicker than the night outside, swallowing his flashlight beam. And there it was, the ledger, resting atop a crate, as if waiting for him. He grabbed it. The second his fingers brushed the leather cover, the ground shuddered violently. Shadows erupted around him, writhing mud shapes lunging at him from every side. He stumbled back, dragging the ledger, throwing himself against the wall to escape the grasping mud. Whispers filled the air, human yet not human, echoing the names of missing workers, their voices pleading, accusing, warning. Ethan's mind raced. The notebook had hinted at the solution. Return it to where it belongs. Complete the ledger. Set the site to rest. Gritting his teeth, he dragged himself outside, through the stormy mud, toward the marked area on the map. The shadows surged, trying to pull him down, but he forced each step, each heave, forward. Finally, he laid the ledger on the exposed steel plate described in the notes. The mud convulsed one last time, a deafening gurgle, then stilled. Silence returned, heavy and absolute. Ethan collapsed, gasping, mud-streaked and soaked. He had survived, but as he looked at the empty, quiet yard, he knew it wasn't over. Something had been appeased, but only temporarily. The first pale light of dawn crept across the Allegheny foothills, glinting on slick mud and broken timbers. Ethan sat on the porch of the main house, shivering, exhausted, clutching the ledger. He had survived the night, but his mind was a storm of fear and disbelief. What had attacked him wasn't entirely supernatural, at least not in the way ghost stories described, but it was something born from human neglect, greed, and the secrets buried beneath the mill. He watched the forest edge, half expecting the shadows to return, half hoping they wouldn't. Birds began to stir, cautious at first, then gradually filling the air with sound. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying a faint scent of rain and mud. For the first time in hours, Ethan felt a fragile sense of calm, but he also knew the ledger was only part of the story. Records had been made, names had been remembered, the consequences documented, but the land itself, the mistakes of decades, weren't easily erased. He would have to remain vigilant, protect the site, ensure that no one disturbed it again. Ethan rose, stiff and sore, and began walking back toward his truck. The path was familiar now, Every ridge and puddle burned into his memory. He would leave this place, but it would leave its mark on him forever. As he reached the pickup, a faint gurgle echoed from the direction of the mill. He froze, eyes narrowing. Nothing moved. The sun climbed higher, melting the last of the fog. Yet deep down, Ethan knew some part of the darkness would always linger here, patient, waiting for the next mistake, the next trespasser. He started the engine, mud splashing under the tires, and drove down the winding road. Behind him, the logging camp settled back into silence, but the earth itself seemed to breathe, carrying the secrets of the past, and the warning that some truths never die.